Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. It's my great pleasure to have you on tonight. We are having Mary McQuillan from Livestock Logic take us through the findings from recent studies uncovering the major causes of ewe mortality. And then we're joined by an expert guest panel who will then take us on to discuss the big hitters affecting ewes in different production systems and delve into the tools available for sheep enterprises to manage risk and optimise the survival of ewe and lambs. So it's great, everyone who sent in questions pre-webinar. So thank you, and I'm sure there will be a few more come out as we progress through the presentations. So the topic of tonight's webinar is obviously best practice lambing. Just a bit of housekeeping to get started. This control panel will be at the top right-hand corner of your screen. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. The red arrow button on the left collapses and reinstates the panel if you want to get a better look at your computer screen. Because we can't hear you, please type the questions in the box provided and we'll attend to them at the end of everyone's presentations this evening, and as well as those questions who have been sent in earlier. Please make your questions as succinct as possible. We do have a few to get through tonight, so make sure they're really clear, and if you can, even type them into the presenter who you want to address them. So we have four wonderful experts joining us this evening. Mary McQuillan of Livestock Logic. Mary is a production animal veterinarian and is the principal investigator in the 2019 to 2021 project Unlocking the Keys to Ewe Survival, which Livestock Logic are the lead organisation on. Mary is an executive member of the sheep, camelid, goat veterinarian arm of the Australian Veterinary Association and is currently undertaking a Doctor of Veterinary Studies at Charles Sturt University. So thanks for joining us, Mary. Next, Caroline Jacobson of Murdoch University is graduated as a vet over 20 years ago. She spent time in a mixed vet practice and then did a PhD in sheep health, focusing on parasites and nutrition. Caroline teaches veterinary science and animal science at Murdoch University and is involved in a number of projects with the sheep production team. She's currently leading a national project on managing maiden ewes to improve reproduction performance and recently led a review for MLA into dystocia in ewes. Welcome, Caroline. Paul Nilon from Nilon Farm Health in Tasmania is a sheep and beef vet and production advisor in Tasmania, where he has been working for the last 30 years. He's a graduate of the McKinnon Project and is a member of the Australian College of Vet Scientists in Epidemiology. Paul's special interests are in livestock health and production, particularly in beef and sheep, nutrition on pasture, supplementary feeding, grazing systems, and increasingly grazing under irrigation. Thanks for joining us, Paul. The next presenter, fourth and very much not the least, Gordon Refshauge, is a small ruminant reproduction scientist with New South Wales DPI. He started working with DPI in 2008, managing the Sheep Genetics Information Nucleus block at Cowra for the Sheep CRC. He's been involved in sheep research projects in the fields of genetics, nutrition, meat science, and reproduction. So welcome, Gordon, and welcome to all our presenters this evening. Thanks so much for being on. So I will now make Mary the presenter, who will take you through the findings of the recent studies, if my thing works, of the Unlocking the Keys to Ewe Survival. So you should see something popping up now, Mary.
Beautiful. Okay, can we see that?
Yes, great. Thanks, Mary.
Beautiful. Okay, everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Like Hilary said, I'm Mary McQuillan, so I'm one of the vets from Hamilton at a clinic called Livestock Logic, and I'll go through with you a short presentation on the project that we've been working on, Unlocking the Keys to Ewe Survival. So the main objective of our project was to work out what the causes of ewe death were over the lambing period for commercial non-merino ewes in southern Australia. So 3 things we wanted to gain from this project was we wanted to get a sense of what the death rate of ewes was over the lambing period. We then also wanted to identify the causes of those deaths over that period, as well as identify the factors contributing to the ewe death. So in order to do so, we had a study population of 40 farms over a 2-year period. So they were commercial farms that had to have flocks above 1,000 non-merino ewes, and the producers needed to be able to monitor and record the ewe deaths over the lambing period. And most of the farms that we chose scanned for multiples and differentially managed their multiples. So they were already practicing best practice medicine in that sense. So it was all conducted over southern Australia between New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and WA. We had 32 farms that were around for both years of the project, and then 8 needed to be replaced in the second year just due to logistical reasons. So of those 40 properties, essentially we needed to get 3 pieces of information from them. First of all, a veterinary team would go out at 3 time periods to conduct post-mortem investigations. So we would do that any time from the time the ewes were first placed in their lambing paddocks all the way up until lamb marking, and we'd go out 3 times. The farmers were also asked to record any ewe deaths that they found whenever they did their routine paddock checks. Now, it's important to note that those were routine checks as they would usually do. We didn't want them doing anything different from their usual farming practices. So they would record any deaths that were obvious as what it was. So for example, if they had a stuck lamb, for example, that would be recorded as the cause of death. Or if they had a uterine prolapse or something like that, then that would also be recorded as a death. If it wasn't known, it was just simply put it as an unknown. Then finally, ewes were also counted in and out of the paddocks from that time point that they were first placed in up until marking, and then essentially between the farm diary and the paddock observations, we could then get the death rate. So the death rate on average in 2019 was 2.5% over that lambing period. In 2020, it was slightly lower. And what we found was our top 25% of producers in this study were sitting at below 1.5% mortality over that period, whereas the bottom 25 were sitting at 5 and above. So what that really tells us is that there were some great results, but there is definitely still some room for improvement. What we also found in doing the initial analysis of this project, and we certainly haven't finished delving into it deeply yet, but what we've found so far is that twin and triplet bearing ewes were at a higher risk, as well as ewes that were above 5 years old. So good to keep in mind that those are our high risk groups that we know about so far, and more to come as we keep on analysing our results. So in terms of the farmer diagnosed causes of death, what farmers generally found was that stuck lambs were the most common cause in both years of the project. So in both years they really found that that was the main issue. Second to that was a no obvious cause of death, and that makes complete sense because most of the time you can't just look at a dead body and know exactly what it is unless it's something obvious like a stuck lamb or a uterine prolapse, like I said before. So you really need to do those post-mortems in order to get a sense of what you're really dealing with. So when you do those post-mortems, then you're getting much less unknown causes of death. And what we did find was, although we were finding a lot of these difficult lambings were one of the main causes, we were also getting a lot of cases of blood poisoning and trauma. So the blood poisoning and trauma can link in with each other, and I'll explain that more in the next slide. But blood poisoning can also be caused from conditions like a uterine infection, or what we would call a metritis. And the trauma cases can be due to something like nerve damage post-lambing, or a ruptured bladder or uterus. So with these dystocia issues, like I said, they really can link in with the other conditions. So you get a difficult lambing that can lead to a ruptured uterus because the lambs can't get out, and which then can lead to an abdominal infection, which is a blood poisoning, and can also link to conditions like hypercalcemia, which can either cause the difficult lambing or the difficult lambing can cause milk fever. So it's all a bit complicated, but they all do interlink. But what we really did find was that for every 2 cases of obvious dystocia, there was an extra case that was missed without doing a full postmortem exam. So that's really important to keep in mind, that by not doing postmortems, you really are missing out on some of those causes, and not just for dystocia, for other traumatic causes as well. So in summary, where do you sit in terms of your ewe mortality over lambing? So what's your death rate? Are you in below 2%? If so, then you're sitting with the top 25% of the producers that we had in our study. If it's above 5%, then you're sitting in the lowest 25%, and just shows that there's just some room for improvement. And then also to bear in mind, do you have a high risk flock or mob? So do you have a lot of ewes that are above that 5-year age bracket, or a lot of twin or triplet bearing mobs, because we know that they're the main at-risk mobs so far. And then farmer observations are definitely not a bad guide at all, and I'd highly recommend that you, when you're checking your lambing paddocks, to record these deaths, and anything that's obvious, record them, and then sort of add it up at the end to get a sense. But like I said, for every 2 cases of obvious dystocia, we're getting 1 extra case is missed without doing a full postmortem exam. So really is important in the sense to engage with the vet. You can do these postmortems, and you can find out what those unknown causes of death are. And most ewe deaths are coming back to this dystocia issue, so this difficult lambing issue, but that's something that we can manage. So to finish, I'd just like to make some acknowledgements. So thank you first of all to MLA for funding this project, and then also to the wonderful project team, field assistance and analysis team, who it all wouldn't have been possible without. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. Appreciate your time. Thanks, Hilary, all done.
Great, thanks so much for that, Mary. Great to set the scene with what everyone will be hearing a bit more on tonight. So if you have any questions for Mary, please do send them through. I will get everyone through their presentations, and then we'll go back through them. So I'll just make myself the presenter now. Just check that you can see that. Right. Excellent. Okay, so now we have Gordon Refshauge, who's going to take us through his little presentation on a checklist for you during leading up to lambing and during lambing. So thanks, Gordon.
Thanks very much, Hilary. And it's a nice presentation, Mary. Well done. Just in the interests of transparency, at the research station here at Carra, we lose around 4% of the ewes over the year, and 3% of those occur around the time of lambing, late pregnancy and early lactation. And what you see, what you've presented there, aligns really well with what we see here. For my presentation, I just have the one slide, and I was asked to really address the best practice considerations in the less intensive management systems, which in my mind is either the mixed farming zones or the rangelands production systems. So there's a few things on the slide, but there's really only just a couple of things to do there. And the first of those, and this is what I'd recommend everybody consider in every case, firstly is to get condition scoring completed at the beginning of mating, and take records for that. Now, if you're not a confident condition scorer, then the absolute minimum effort is to handle about 50 ewes and record how many of those you think have a bony short loin. That's the bones of the backbone between the long ribs, the chest, and the hips, so the short loin. Feel how many, and keep a record for how many are bony or how many are muscly. And over time, this will enable you to monitor the relationship between the pre-joining condition of those ewes and the scanning result. You may want to do this simple monitoring for the ewes before lambing as well, and examine those results against ewe and lamb numbers at marking. That's particularly helpful management because it's such a good tool, condition scoring, as a predictor of the future outcomes. Second point is to call the scanner. Accuracy in pregnancy scanning is as much in your hands as it is in the scanners. So you want the scanner to arrive 5 to 6 weeks after the rams are removed. As those pregnancies develop and the fetuses get larger, it becomes more difficult to identify whether you have singles or twins. So timing is absolutely critical to the accuracy of pregnancy scanning. Having done so, I strongly recommend scanning for twins and separating those twins. The reason for that is because you won't learn how to manage those types of animals optimally in your environment if you don't start doing that. But of course, if you're not taking records, such as how many twin ewes that you have, how many ewes and lambs are being marked, you won't be able to really take lessons from that over time and in the past. You can pick up on your own experience and you become more confident. You definitely always use the number of twins in your evaluation of the pasture resources, so you know how many ewes that you have that are having the highest feed requirement, and you can examine your pasture base, particularly the grass budget. So it doesn't really matter which environment you're in, whether that's a pastoral or a mixed farming system. You're really making an assessment for how much grass, and you're trying to make an estimate for the adequacy of that feed base and offering the twin-bearing ewes the best feeds. And of course, in identifying twins from singles, you can allocate the lower quality feed base to the singles to avoid them from getting too heavy in condition and the lambs inside them getting too large. Once you have undertaken a pregnancy scan, of course, you can start to plan your other management activities such as shearing, crutching, vaccinations, etc. But in particular, thinking about predator reduction activities. Now, most predators are going to be territorial, so the timing of control and coordination of control actions with your neighbours is a timely issue, and it requires a fair bit of communication and forward planning. I've listed lowering twin mob size where possible. This really depends on how many spare paddocks you have with adequate feed resources, but it's a relatively simple little addition on top of a standard management package that can just make a little bit of an improvement in some years, or quite a lot of improvement in others, to the number of lambs that you wean, particularly out of the twin mob. If you're really trying to add another level on top of that less intensive management system, you could also use an assessment of udder development to help you allocate early twin-bearing ewes to a particular lambing paddock if that's your interest, or you could get the pregnancy scanner to include fetal aging. One of the most important things in my mind is to consider wetting and drying the ewes' udders at marking. It is one of the most important reproduction pieces of information you can get on your flock. I just tell everybody to just go and do it and don't make excuses and get extra labour. So it's just so valuable because it tells you everything about which ewes are capable of rearing lambs. When you put your hands on the udder, you can tell if these ewes are capable of rearing lambs or not. If they've had their teats shorn off, if they have infections in those udders, or if the udder structure or teat structure is breaking down, you can make a decision without compromising the next round of reproduction. It's a particularly helpful activity, and so I recommend identifying either ear tagging or ear notching those ewes that are land and lost or dry, and keep track of those numbers as well. And therein is the last point, which is to review the data you have. Definitely keep records on the number of ewes joined, their pregnancy rate at scanning, the scanning rates, how many singles and twins, the marking rate, and how many ewes are dry. And those four simple things there will tell you where your reproductive wastage is occurring. That gives you so much feedback, even in this less intensive management approach. Hilary, thanks very much. That's my next slide.
Sorry, I'm not sure if you got any of that. I had my mute button still on, but thanks, Gordon. A really succinct list there for everyone to take away and implement, particularly going into this lambing. So a great start for the panel presentations. I have Caroline on next, who's going to take us through pretty much Gordon's list from a Mediterranean zone perspective. So thanks, Caroline.
Thank you for having me on your panel tonight. It's been a really great presentation from Mary, and what I wanted to present for the next couple of minutes was a Mediterranean and a mixed farming perspective on the information that was presented by Mary, some of which was collected again in those Mediterranean mixed farming areas of Western Australia, and also in the context of Gordon's recommendations, which obviously cover you know, a lot of the factors that we see in those Mediterranean zones. So the first point we would say is consistently through research and practice is that body condition score is critical to all stages of the breeding cycle. So Gordon made a really good point about the importance of body condition scoring. And again, we would emphasise that both from the perspective of ewe survival and, you know, retaining those ewes for the next breeding cycle, but also importantly for lamb survival as well. So again, you know, we've got really good numbers now across a range of different types of farms, different sheep breeds, really highlighting that dystocia is an important contributor to both ewe and lamb mortality. And we've got really clear indicators that ewes that are either over-conditioned or under-conditioned are at higher risk, meaning that ewes that are over-fat, and particularly those single-bearing ewes which are over-conditioned, are at higher risk of dystocia, so higher risk of losing the ewe and the lamb. And particularly for twin-bearing ewes, where the ewes are under-conditioned, because we know that lambs which have a lower birth weight are also at higher risk of dystocia as well. So again, one of the key take-home messages is body condition scoring throughout that breeding cycle, having a really good handle on where your ewes are at and matching that up with your feed budget so that they're hitting those critical times, you know, at mating, mid-pregnancy, late pregnancy, at lambing, in the body condition scores that put the ewes at lowest risk of mortality and give the lambs a best chance of survival through to weaning. So the tools that we have there are obviously body condition scoring, and that gives us, I guess, half of the information that we need. The other half is really targeting our feed, taking that body condition scoring, knowing that the targets are going to be quite different for ewes which are pregnant with single or multiple pregnancies. So again, emphasising the importance for scanning ewes for the pregnancy, and again, that additional value that comes from scanning for multiples. So then managing those single and multiple bearing mobs according to their requirement will have improved, you know, benefits for both the survival of the ewe and the lamb, plus also allows you to efficiently allocate your feed resources to where it's going to be most effective. So again, addressing some of the issues in the Mediterranean zone, mixed farming zones, cropping farms, and particularly in light of, I guess, seasonal variability, is what are some of the tools or what's some of the challenges that we have? You know, what do we need to do in a late break? Well, in terms of addressing the feed gap, again, knowing how important nutrition is through mid and late pregnancy for getting those ewes and lambs in the right condition for lambing, is looking at the feed resources. So if we don't have adequate pasture, an alternative strategy that we've been looking at, again, across different zones in Australia, is grazing cereal crops during late pregnancy. And this has been shown to be a useful strategy for filling the feed gap. But again, when we're applying, running ewes on those cereal pastures, the ewes do need careful management, they need careful observation, and mineral supplementation is important in that scenario. Hilary, I think we're going to emails. Okay, so again, that's a strategy that we can discuss further in question if people are interested. But again, we've got emerging information on how the grazing cereal strategies can be implemented and what are the types of supplementation that are of value in different zones. The other time that we need to consider the mineral supplementation as well as just the amount of feed on offer and supplementary feeding is for ewes which are receiving supplementary, high amounts of grain, particularly through mid and late pregnancy, because we know that that can be an important risk factor for some of those metabolic diseases such as hypocalcemia, which can cause mortalities in the ewes in its own right, but low grade or subclinical hypocalcemia can also we suspect that it predisposes ewes to dystocia and difficult birth. So again, we would encourage people that where they're supplementing grain through late pregnancy is that they pay careful attention to the mineral supplements that are applied. One of the big unknowns that is currently being addressed by our colleagues at the University of Western Australia is the role of estrogenic clovers. So again, estrogenic clovers are widely distributed across southern Australia. There's a lot of historical understanding that the estrogenic clovers can impact certainly the ability of the ewes to get pregnant. But again, one of the uncertainties is how grazing estrogenic clovers might impact ewe survival. So I think this is a watch that space, certainly for properties or farms which are getting unexplained losses or unusual patterns of ewe losses. We would encourage people to look at the composition of their pasture and consider getting the types of pastures evaluated. And there's certainly, again, the team at UWA has been working with farmers to really determine what varieties of clover they have and whether the estrogenic varieties might be contributing to reproductive problems in those flocks. Finally, one of the other tools that we have for controlling certain or managing the risk of dystocia, which again is one of the leading causes of ewe and lamb mortality, is basically breeding direction. So again, we would encourage people to sit down, regularly reassess their breeding objectives, where you're at with your ewe base at the moment, where you want to be in 5 and 10 years, and really consider reproduction as part of that overall breeding plan. So Sheep Genetics are releasing ASBVs for traits which will feed into reproduction, and some of those include birth weight or lamb birth weight and lambing ease. So again, where we have that information, we can feed that into our decisions around particularly ram selection. And again, it's not a one size fits all, and the decisions around how we apply those ASBVs, where we put the emphasis, what values or what metrics, what numbers you're looking at, will really depend on your ewe base and your breeding direction. So that's an ongoing area where, again, we'd encourage people to be having that conversation with their ram breeders and then going from there. So thank you very much, and we'll be happy to answer questions in the question time.
Great, thanks so much for that, Caroline, and apologies for interrupting you with my email screen. I forgot that mine was on. So great, thanks so much for that, the perspective from the Mediterranean zone. We're on to Paul now, who's going to give us comments from the high rainfall zone. Are you right to go, Paul?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Hilary, and great privilege to be working with such an erudite crew. Now, My comments relate to the high rainfall zone, and here in Tasmania that's often also integrated with high value cropping under irrigation. And I'll also add that I haven't actually seen or spoken to Gordon or Caroline about what they were going to say. But the first point is that body condition score is critical at all stages of the lamb breeding cycle. From our point of view, maximising body condition score for conception can create a whole raft of issues downstream with the increased risk of metabolic disease, lameness and dystocia, particularly dystocia in the singles. I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about hypercalcemia on irrigated winter grass, straight grasses, and particularly winter cereals. As Caroline has previously pointed out, it's highly likely that in addition to the downer sheep as a clinical manifestation, subclinical hypercalcemia contributes to difficult births and overall general maternal fitness and therefore lamb survival. Lots of my clients, and I presume it's the same everywhere, have done the lifetime ewe management courses, and they're absolutely fantastic in raising awareness of how to condition score and what targets are for merino sheep. But on the whole, we're finding that they're not applicable to prime lamb ewes. So generally speaking, as mentioned in the first point, if your ewes are over-conditioned at mating, you may well have a fantastic conception result, but managing them to get their weight down to make them easier and fitter maternal prospects at the other end is really difficult. And from that, it follows that the green dry matter, or the FOO if you prefer, are probably not applicable either. And that's particularly the case during pregnancy, where you're trying to sometimes hold them back rather than have them go ahead. So the sort of targets that we talk about for merinos, you know, sort of 700, 800 kilos of FOO to maintain during pregnancy, we'll see many of our prime lamb candidates actually blow out. In the long term, we argue that body condition score is best managed by manipulation of stocking rates, which of course is a long-term project. Individual seasons may require some creative management solutions. So here we're sort of starting to look at confinement feeding or letting ewes out on pasture one day in two, or you know, really giving them the hard yards to try and get the body condition down, or at least not have it blow out. And obviously in not so good years, you may need some judicious supplementation, but that's not so much of a problem as what we see in comparison with the Mediterranean zone. And finally, the point that is not there, but Gordon reminded me of it, the importance of wet and drying at lamb marking, or even observing them as they come into the yards for their pre-lambing treatments. Ewes that have been scanned in lamb but don't look like they're going to lamb, if there's any number of them at all, then you really should start to consider the possibility that you've got a background disease going on. And here in the high rainfall zone, the two are Campylobacter and Toxo. There are others, and they may actually cut a bit of a path of destruction with no visible abortions, or very few. So just keep that in mind. And so I look forward to some questions, and thank you, Hilary.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Paul. Nice and short and sweet. So while I've got you, we'll start on the questions. So if you do have any, please send them through to our expert panel. I've got heaps lined up to get through. So make sure you send them through, and if you can, just highlight who you would like to answer them. If not, I can direct them on this end. So Paul, while you're there, how did the findings from the ewe mortality project that Mary delivered on compare to what you see in high rainfall zones? Was there anything surprising or unexpected?
Yes, I'd have to say that I was really quite surprised by the fact that dystocia ranked number one. And I'm not, I mean, I absolutely concur that the research is almost certainly right. I mean, the environments over which it was conducted, in some cases, were not radically dissimilar to ours. I guess what it brought home to me, in fact, is that dystocia, in fact, has many underlying causes, some of which have been highlighted by myself and Gordon and Caroline. And so really it's up to producers to tease out what of those factors may be operating on their places to try and improve them.
Thank you, and thanks for the question. The next one, Caroline, if you wouldn't mind also commenting on Mary's study, which is focused on non-merino ewes. Do you think the results apply across merinos?
Yes, so this has been a really interesting question, and we've been back looking through some of the older research projects to see if we could find any, you know, other merino projects to compare. At the start, I would have said I thought that I anticipated that our findings might be quite breed specific, but as the project went on and we were finding more issues with dystocia, and importantly, it wasn't issues with dystocia because the lambs were simply too big. It was more issues where we thought, that the lambs were, that the ewe had failed to be able to deliver those lambs. Those lambs were a reasonable size and they were a reasonable presentation, so there was no physical reason that the ewe couldn't deliver. And so it started to become apparent that the next area that we should be looking at are like, well, what are these underlying risk factors for dystocia? And so again, I think that's where Paul's obviously highlighted the role of hypercalcemia. And so we've got no reason to think that that process would be any different in a merino sheep carrying 2 4-kilo lambs or 4.5-kilo lambs as it would be in the non-merino ewes where we had that observation. The other surprising factor, I think, for me as a vet, not as experienced as Paul, was as we were doing the postmortems, was again these other secondary issues related to the dystocia, like the traumatic injuries that were occurring in the ewes. And again, if we just looked at our data for merino ewes, a lot of those cases would have gone down as no cause known, but it was only with the detailed postmortems that it became obvious that it was, traumatic secondary to a difficult birth. So again, we've got no biological reason to think that that would be any different. So I think, and we've obviously got other projects that are ongoing with merinos, and so we're going to be looking at this, at the mortality in merinos, the risk factors, and where we can, the cause of death. But at this stage, we've got no reason to think that the overriding recommendations that we've been discussing tonight would be any different for merinos.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Gordon, would you be able to touch on pastoral production systems in terms of your checklist? Can everything be applied, and particularly for those in rangeland areas where supplementary feeding is not possible?
So, of course, in the rangelands environments, providing supplementary feed becomes more and more difficult and more constrained, and it really depends on where you are, I think, in relation to where cotton is grown. So the value, of course, of feedstuffs like cottonseed is that you can provide a dump in the paddock and make multiple dumps over time, and the sheep and even cattle will just slowly work their way through that feed base. The alternative, of course, is to manage total grazing pressure and to try to maintain as best you possibly can a diversity of feed base. So your country can respond, particularly in the rangelands environment. Your country can respond to the variable rainfall it's likely to experience throughout the season, and try to be as tactical in your management of those conditions as you possibly can. Having information under your belt, like how many twins have I got and where are the twins and how do I get them to the best possible feed, or how do I provide supplementary feed, is really underpinned by the practice of pregnancy scanning. So I guess there's two things: you continue to operate tactically for your environment, continue to try to maintain a diverse feed base, And if you can, you provide dumps of cottonseed if you've got it available, if you're lucky enough.
Great, thanks so much for that, Gordon. A few questions. I'll throw this one to Paul, but Caroline and Gordon, if you want to jump in with your recommendations afterwards for your areas, that would be great. So Paul, just touching on that question I sent you earlier about what evidence is there for hypocalcemia and subclinical hypocalcemia induced dystocia. And then following on from that, what is the current best practice for calcium and or magnesium supplementation pre-lambing? And this is in regard to high rainfall area of ryegrass clover pastures in northern Tasmania.
Okay. Well, I guess the evidence of hypercalcemia, in fact, is the increasing incidence of mass strandings of sheep. So that's the clinical tip of the iceberg, if you like, showing that unless the calcium nutrition is managed on a fairly tight basis on the grass and cereal winter grazing, then it can come unstuck magnificently. And I mean, we're not talking about, you know, a sheep here or a sheep there. I mean, we're sometimes talking about, you know, 10% of a mob going down, sometimes with a stressor, sometimes just with a change of feed. And the interesting thing is that the change of feed may be from you know, a less than magnificent pasture to something like an irrigated short rotation rye or a winter cereal. And previously, a lot of these have been actually put down as pregnancy toxemia, but the response to treatment and also, you know, looking at the blood parameters, there's no doubt that they're primarily hypercalcemia. Now, as for best practice, this is a huge subject, and I have to approach it from the point of view of a little bit of science and a little bit of experience and a little bit of pet theory, which is what consultants tend to do anyway. But what I think is probably the best practice at this point in time is firstly well, anything that's being supplemented with grain, the grain should always be spiked with calcium or calcium magnesium. So straight limestone at 2% or dolomite at 4%. That's pretty straightforward. When it comes to additional calcium supplementation on a pasture base, my sort of current thinking is that sheep on mixed sort of perennial grass and legume pastures probably don't need any calcium supplementation, at least until the point of lambing, and a lot of years not even then, just depending on exactly how much they've got available and, you know, what dry tucker and that sort of thing is available. If you have sheep on lush, grass-dominant winter grazing, and specifically cereals, they probably need some level of calcium supplementation pretty much all the way through pregnancy, or at least the last half of pregnancy and into lactation. Now, I mean, you can go all out with really flash supplementation things, and there's chapter and verse written about this brand of calcium versus that brand of calcium. Look, I really don't think that that's the critical issue. It's actually just providing calcium so that they can get it into their system. The final point I'd make, which might seem a little bit paradoxical, is that you can over-supplement with calcium if they're on dry tucker and you're supplementing them, or even mixed perennial pastures, and then they go on to the irrigated cereal crop, because I suspect, I don't know for sure, that under that scenario, when they're hyper supplemented with good pasture calcium already available, their efficiency of absorption goes down. And then when they're put onto the lolly shop of the cereal crop or the straight short rotation rye, they're not interested in supplements anyway. But that's the time when they actually need the supplement, but their efficiency of absorption goes down. And so we've seen lots and lots of mass go downs in that situation. Was I brief enough?
Yeah, I did perfect. Thanks so much for that, Paul. Caroline or Gordon, do you have anything to add to that? Just unmute yourself if you do, and I'll be able to see you.
Look, this is Caroline Jacobson. I think Paul, as usual, has done a terrific job describing that, and again, that would follow what we see again in Western Australia. I suppose the only other points I would make is that again, colleagues at CSU with different sites around Australia, including Murdoch University, have looked at again different crops across Australia and looked at different forms of supplement, and my understanding of that was that there was no difference between the commercial supplement versus the homemade, the homemade standard mixture of supplement. And within that, I suppose the best supplement's going to be the ones that the ewes are willing to eat. And we've seen some unfortunate cases where people thought that they were providing mineral supplements to sheep, but it was actually just injectable trace elements, not understanding that that's not a calcium supplement. And we've seen other unfortunate problems where people have purchased licks, but the licks are or loose mixes of calcium, but that also include urea. And again, obviously, once those sheep are onto pasture, they really don't need the urea, and in fact that can be detrimental if it affects the palatability and their willingness to take up the calcium. So again, I would encourage people to just take careful advice that's locally relevant and ensuring that the best mineral supplement is the one that the sheep are willing to eat particularly through that high risk period in late pregnancy and through the start of lambing.
Hilary, if I can just add to that as well. So in particular, uniform feed bases that are growing rapidly, particularly rich in protein, for example, and can be very high in energy. They can be very highly digestible. And I've seen some 14 plus megajoule energy feeds in the last 12 months. And animals have had problems on those really rich feeds. If you put an animal from a maintenance base to a grain that's got 10, 12 rapidly fermentable starches, maybe we're seeing some sort of issues around the transition of animals onto those feed bases. So certainly understand what's in the feed if it's going to be a standard across years for your farm system. I'd also go so far as to look at the sodium and potassium concentration in that feed and see whether you need to tailor your supplementary feed mix of calcium, cause mag and salt. So lime, cause mag, salt for your animals. We've done some work here at the research station. I've been involved in mineral nutritional grains and cereals work for about 5 or 6 years now. And at the Carra Research Station, we're now budgeting 40 grams per head per day in our feed base because of the differences in the abundance of potassium and the absence of sodium. And we're using a weight ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 of lime, cause mag and salt. And I think that's pretty handy advice.
Great, thank you. Thank you all our panel for weighing in. Gordon, while I've got you, I'll just follow on these questions with another sort of supplementary feed question. This is a pretty specific one from someone who sent in saying, if feeding ewes on a small sacrifice paddock in the last trimester, they're composites, on cereal and pasture, hay and grain, the ration is barley at 800 grams per day for twins and 400 grams per day for singles. What is the least amount of times I can feed per week? So can I feed twice a week or is that not enough? So he's just trying to work on labour efficiency but not have any negative production or health issues.
Yeah, so it's a good question, so practical. Firstly, I have the view that 800 grams for twins barley will be the primary energy source in a feed containment where the alternate source is hay, and 800 grams for a twin bearing composite ewes probably not going to be enough in my book. I'd increase that. And likewise 400 grams for singles, probably also a bit low, but you're the manager, you will understand what that means for your farm system and how those animals are responding, particularly in their body condition score. You'll tell if they're looking hungry and they're losing condition. The question really is about how do you minimise the amount of labour you've got to commit to this, and I would operate on a basis that your ewes can handle being fed every 3 days. If they're in lick feeders, you want to make sure that they are screwed down as tight as you can get them, and look at feeder systems that help to minimise the rate of intake, so you're getting them, so the feed's always available for those animals, but they're only eating it at the rate that you want them to. And once you've got that system operating, you only need to top the feed up every second, twice a week, every 3 or so days. That's my advice there. It's hands-on to start to find your labour efficiency.
Great, thank you, Gordon, and thank you for the question. Caroline, just following on from that, not so much in terms of a supplementary feeding point of view, but from a checking the ewes during lambing, in composite ewe flocks, how do you best balance leaving ewes as undisturbed as possible during lambing with effectively checking ewes and assisting where required?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and it was one that we addressed or we discussed with again a panel of experts in a recent review of Nokia and what are our recommendations around it. In speaking again, and we went out and we spoke to various producers that do this well, and the overwhelming consensus was the ideal amount of monitoring really depends on the ewes and what they're used to. And again, when the ewes are again used to having people moving around them, it's not it doesn't disturb them too much. The amount of monitoring might be quite different to ewes which are not handled, and where going into the paddocks to inspect them is actually going to cause more issues. So again, I would give 2 answers. So for ewes which again are not well handled or not used to that human contact, we would say that frequent monitoring during that peak lambing period can end up causing more issues with mismothering and in turn dystocia by disturbing the ewes during lambing than it can actually help by pulling out stuck lambs and so on. So what we would say is in that scenario is that the best approach is to be very proactive. I think Gordon touched on this really well in his summary. So if we know who are the highest risk ewes and we can prioritise the paddocks to them, and where possible reduce the mob size. So by prioritising the smaller paddocks, the sheltered paddocks and the paddocks with good feed to those twin bearing ewes, that can help. And then at that point, again, if the ewes are not used to people moving around them, at that stage it's probably on balance the best off to have a hands-off approach. The flip side scenario is where we've got either again sheep that are well handled, or where we've got a scenario a bit as Paul referred to, is where we're just seeing lots of problems with ewes down, lambs that are stuck, in which case it's at that point we've got to go in and do something basically to maintain the welfare through the flocks. So again, in that scenario where we're getting an inordinate number of ewes which are struggling you know, through that last stage of labour, that's when the on balance that it's going to be better. Again, this is something to discuss with your breeder. There's certainly breeders in merinos and in composites and non-merino breeds which actively select for ewes which have, I suppose, good temperament around lambing. So again, if this is an issue on your property where you're getting lots of lambs stuck and you're having to go in and intervene, then certainly it's worth discussing this with your breeder, just from the point of view of getting the optimum birth rates, looking at do they use these lambing ease ASBVs, but also that maternal temperament, because that way if you do have to go in, pull a lamb, those ewes that have, you know, I guess a genetically better temperament have a better chance of going back and mothering up with that lamb. So again, be interesting to get Gordon's perspective in that he was really hands-on with the nucleus flock where they were intensively monitoring ewes over lambing, and it would be great just to get his perspective from his zone as well.
Thanks, Caroline. So my view is that once you start pulling lambs, you keep pulling lambs. It seems to be a function that when it unwinds in a lambing paddock, it unwinds. So you start to try and catch a ewe that you think's in trouble, or is obviously in trouble, and that disturbs the next ewes around that are just about to start lambing or have lambs, you know, entering the birth canal, and you'll be back there the next day. So this is the difficulty. If you intend on monitoring your ewes, then do so before they start lambing. Be in the paddocks that are comfortable with you. Don't take the feed cart to do that job. Don't take your dogs unless they're very, very good dogs. So do everything you can to make it all normal, and then minimise the amount of handling on other lambing ewes to capture the animal that needs assistance. There was a study in New Zealand, a report on a flock of ewes in New Zealand that were just placed in the lambing paddock and never observed, and after 40 years their reproduction rates were extraordinary compared to the district averages for the same breeds. So you can solve it through selection over time.
Great, thank you, and thanks for your comments on those, Gordon. Back to you, Paul. If we could just backtrack a little bit. I've had a question come in. What are your body condition score targets for pre-lambing singles and twins? Are they the same as the new LTEM targets for non-merinos? And also, what are your food targets for lambing? Paul, if you're there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yep.
Sorry, okay. Now, what was the question? Oh, yeah, food. Let's start with food. Look, fundamentally for meat sheep, you know, specific meat sheep breeds, no matter what you provide them, it's probably not going to be enough, you know, because they reach a ceiling on intake. So, you know, you can say that for a composite type ewe that you have 1,600 or 1,800 kilos available for a twin bearing ewe once she's birthed and lactating, but the chances are she's still going to go backwards. For singles, single ewes at lambing and lactation, look, depending on your stocking rate and how the season's gone and everything like that, but if you can provide them with sort of 1,400, then you're usually fairly close to the mark. During pregnancy, where we're finding issues is in fact that if the sort of lifetime ewe management targets were around about 700 or 800 for merinos, in fact, you know, we're finding that both single and twin bearing ewes are tending to blow out on that sort of availability. So we're frequently cutting them back to, if it's easily done, you know, sort of 500, 600 kilos. They still seem to spend all their day with their heads down. I'm blowed if I know when they find time to actually chew their cud. But they still maintain weight on those sort of much lower levels. That's observation rather than hard science. But I noticed that I think some of the other sheep vets and consultants are coming to this similar conclusions. Now, I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Your body conditions or targets
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Look, fundamentally, I would suggest that in our production systems, if you're, and given, you know, that sometimes they don't have huge amounts of time to get to mega condition between weaning and joining again anyway, but if we can have the mob at joining at 3 or 3 and a bit and basically keep them there. Now, you know, as I keep on sort of emphasising, the issue that we're facing is bringing down the overweight ewes down to that sort of, well, maybe 3 or 3 and a bit for twins and even a bit less for singles, so that in wet years in particular, they don't have this cumulative effect of body condition making for lameness, and the lameness makes for a high risk of pregnancy toxemia in particular, and then on those sort of lush grass dominant pastures, they're always going to be prone to hypercalcemia. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Paul. Gordon, just on that, how important is a rising plane of nutrition before the rams go in, and can you compare it to body condition score?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if your ewes are rising in condition, which means they're eating and gaining weight, even if it's a small amount, coming into joining, you will start to increase ovulation rate. If you continue to gain small amounts of weight during mating, you will also get a better reproduction outcome. It will improve. There's still an important difference between static and dynamic sort of conditions of energy balance and of body condition. So if a ewe is in really good nick, 3 condition score or better, then you tend to get less response to improving plane and nutrition when compared to an animal that's in leaner condition. So it also depends on how you manage this, depends on how responsive your animals are to that improving condition. And that will be a function of their genotype and of the season of mating. So if you're joining your ewes in autumn, there'll be day length response. If your ewes are highly fecund genotypes, then you need to join your ewes in slightly lower condition and then manipulate weight gain during and pre-mating and during mating to really just pull up or advance that ovulation rate so you can get a better scanning rate. So you can use current condition score, and if they're coming in joining low condition score, you can always provide some spike feeds, like pulse grains, for example. Lupins are particularly good at this, but also providing the animals access to lucerne or short grain feed base that's going to improve their body condition for a short period of time coming into joining. So you've got a range of tips and tools that you can use to tweak and manipulate pregnancy rates. So you're looking for the lowest dry rates and the highest scanning rates if you're really trying to chase lots of lambs by in.
Great, thank you. And also to you, Gordon, pretty specific question that's come in. If you only has one side of the udder working, no other problems, should we cull her because if she has twins, she'll not have enough milk, or will she produce extra milk from one side? And then on top of that, do you cull ewes that have 1 or 2 small lumps in the udder?
Yeah, good questions. Okay, so when we do a lot of our wetting and drying of ewes at marking, we also do it again at weaning because we sort of collect a lot of data on our sheep. I will always flag that the ewe that has 1 operational teat is a risk. If we, on balance, looking at other production traits, we have merinos here at the research flock. On balance, we take that into account in our breeding decisions, and she will rank poorly, and we will cull her if there's another reason to do so, which could include that her lamb wasn't weighing very much at weaning, or her fleece characteristics are starting to fall apart, or she's getting old, or it's been a problem in the past. If you're risk averse, I would cull that ewe anyway, because if she's got twins, there's every chance that the second lamb will have a real battle on its hand to in front of it to get onto the teat. The comment about milk supply, that's a function of demand. So if a ewe only has one side of her udder operational and she has 2 lambs suckling on it, she will produce more milk to support the demand. That's pretty much a reasonable rule. She might still do a terrific job, but I expect her not to do as good a job as average. If you've got lumps starting to emerge in the udder, my sense for this is it's the start of probably possibly cheesy gland. There could be some other issues. They may then end up being a mastitis in future. So I would give that ewe one more chance in my operation. I would make a note of it and I'd cull her in the second year, or if you're risk averse, cull her straight away.
Thanks, Gordon. I've just had one come in that's a question coming off the back of it. Do you keep a dry sheep after its maiden year?
Yeah, so it depends. So if you're in a self-replacing flock and you want to make improvements in reproduction, you have 2 choices. One is to go fiercely, and that is to cull anything that fails to rear first time. Just get rid of them. If that's a lot of animals, you will really do a lot of damage to your flock structure and slow down the progress in other production traits that are important to you. So self-replacing flocks can be merinos, can be composites, they can be shedding breeds. So you need to manage your numbers and make the decision with flock structure in mind. But if you the rules in genetics are that because reproduction traits are very lowly heritable, it means the role of the environment is very large, so it's hard to sort of see the heritable components there. So the only way to make genetic gain is through accuracy in the selection, and the most accurate way to identify an animal with low reproduction is to give it a second chance. So if she's been scanned wet, has come in dry, ear tag that animal, identify it in some way, and if she ever appears again in the dries at scanning or after lambing, then you get rid of that animal. That will mean you cull fewer ewes, but your accuracy for that selection will be greater, which means your genetic rate of gain will be better than if you just cull her first time with no second chance. So at the end of the day, it comes down to how many have you got, and what does it mean for the other traits in the breeding objective and your flock structure.
Great, thanks, Gordon. Caroline, back to you. Do you have any suggestions for field treatment of vaginal prolapse? This particular questioner has struggled unless you find the ewes within a few hours. They don't find stitching practical, and coat hangers seem difficult.
That's a very flattering question. I think most of my interactions with prolapses over the last few years have all been on the post-mortem table. So I think one of the, I'll cross to Paul on this, but one of the points that I would suggest is that if you're having trouble again across the flock is treating those ewes with calcium or 4-in-1 regardless, because it's possibly a contributing factor. In terms of the individual management, again, it's going back a while. It's often where they've been down and there's a lot of contamination and infection and swelling. That seems to be the biggest, I guess, predictor of how they're then going to go subsequently in terms of whether you could get that swelling down. But I probably need to refer to someone that's got their hands a bit more dirty recently. Paul, have you got any feedback on getting them in and keeping them back in?
Yes, ignore the problem. Look, it seems like it's an increasing issue, and I don't know whether it's increasing because value is increasing or because, in fact, here at least in our neck of the woods, there's been a massive transition away from merino flocks to prime lamb flocks. Now, I've looked at the publications on this a few times over the last few years. Nearly all of them are out of New Zealand, which in one sense is not surprising. So in terms of, before we address treatment, in terms of prevention, look, the Kiwis have had their PERDs, or whatever they call them, over there, claiming that they're going to solve all, I'm talking vaginal prolapses rather than uterine prolapses, had their PERDs over there claiming that they are going to solve all issues with vaginal prolapse by correct calcium, magnesium nutrition. And I don't think they ever have. I mean, some consultants might claim they have, but the industry information suggests otherwise. So I think that that's probably a component, and we should do our best in that regard. But look, the other things that contribute to them, and again, the information is a bit scant, but they seem to be hills, foot disease, body condition, and age. So I guess age is one of the things that a few of us are going to be looking at in an upcoming research project, and that also cuts across to things like teats, but that's another story. Feet disease seems to be absolutely critical. The other one that I'm going to fly a kite on a bit, in fact, is tail length, because many of our merino producers had their tail length roughly correct, and yet they seem determined to cut females' tails as short as finishing lambs, and they probably shouldn't be doing it on fly strike basis, if nothing else. So I've got not a whole lot of information on that, but correct tail length seems to help. Look, in terms of treatments, we've always found the coat hangers, the tees, whatever you want to call them, probably the easiest. But instead of actually tying them to the wool, particularly if you're fond of pre-lamb shearing, as we are here in Tasmania, we found that the simple solution, in fact, was to take the tapes and just put a stitch with some heavy gauge fishing line under the skin. That's probably way less disturbing than trying to suture their vulvas closed. Sometimes they lamb around the coat hanger. At other times, they seem to actually push them out fairly successfully, but that's probably the easiest thing. If they're sort of a bit like a Sharon that's just been through the grand final, the chances are you're neither going to get them back in or keep them in. And finally on that, we are seeing an increase in the incidence of prolapse and or plus or minus evisceration, so a tear in the dorsal part of the vagina and the guts coming out, and there's nothing we can do about that.
Thanks, Paul. Are maiden ewes more susceptible than 2-year-olds or older ewes?
To vaginal prolapse?
Yeah.
No, in my experience, it's the other way around. The older, the older, the more likely, particularly when that's associated with excessive body condition.
Great, thank you. And so the next question also to you, Paul. How many farms are using numb nuts? Are they positive about their experience using the product? Are there financial advantages that you've seen? For example, lamb health, reduced smothering, being able to allay welfare concerns when marketing lamb, etc.
Oh boy, right. You might have to cut me off here. Look, I'll preface the remarks by saying that the people here in Tassie that have adopted numb nuts are those that have been incentivised to do so. Now, that's mostly merino producers who are coming under the RWS or Autovox type things, and they're trying to move away from mulesing. So, in fact, those guys are not only moving away from mulesing, but they're required to have pain relief at lamb marking, and they've not they've not universally sort of gone over to the full numbnut system, because in fact a lot of them still want to use the Tapari rolling gas axe to try and get a little bit more skin tension around the tail. Okay, so with that preamble, the adoption by prime lamb producers has not been great here in Tasmania. It's mostly merino producers. In terms of efficacy, it's a wonderful piece of engineering. How Robin Smith even thought about sort of creating that injection system, one can only contemplate. It works absolutely fantastically on the tails. We can see that because they frequently have sort of just a bit of paresis almost immediately they're let out of the cradle. I am just a little bit concerned that it doesn't work quite so well on the scrotums, but that's on pretty limited observation. Clients of mine that are using it are actually fairly well sold on the efficacy on the scrotums as well. Look, the big issue with numbnuts is in fact that the duration of activity is quite short. So we're talking sort of an hour to sort of a few hours rather than sort of 7 or 8 hours or anything like that. So how advantageous it is in the mothering up again really depends a lot on the size of the enterprise and the size of your lamb marking runs. We've certainly had very positive feedback that the lambs do seem to mother up much better than without it, and there's some published information to back that up. As your flocks get bigger and your lamb marking days get bigger, it may well have worn off by the time it's time to go back to the paddock. And just depending on how you manage your ewes and your lambs, you know, they may either unmother again or have never mothered up. In the best of all possible worlds, we should actually be looking at using numbnuts as it stands, and in addition to a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, so meloxicam either as an injection or as a gel. And the numbnuts takes the short-term approach, and the meloxicam can take the longer-term approach. Patently, if you're going to continue to use the gas axe on the tails, the numbnuts on the testicles alone is probably not going to be as good as using meloxicam alone. And I guess the final thing, and if Robin's listening, he can start working on this. That's Robin Smith, the developer. Maybe we should be looking at using a combination of local anaesthetics that give a longer action.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Paul. Sorry, Gordon, did you have something to add?
No, it's an excellent summary. I totally concur.
Wonderful, thank you. And Caroline, just to bring us home, the last question for this evening, will the best practice guidelines discussed tonight address the risk factors for the important causes of ewe mortality highlighted in the study by Mary?
Okay, I think that's it's actually a really good question. And probably the first clue is that Paul, Gordon and I all independently came to the same conclusions around the importance of body condition score and basically targeting nutrition to really get those condition scores within that ideal range through mid-late or through joining mid-pregnancy, late pregnancy, and then through into lambing. And the reason that works is because it basically helps us to get the lamb birth weights within that sweet spot where the lambs are not too big, not too small. It allows the ewe to be in a good metabolic state where we're not predisposing her to hypocalcemia, predtoxemia during late pregnancy, and we're giving her enough body reserves that she can really lamb down, establish that good bond with the lamb, get up and going, and then really get off to a strong lactation to get the lamb through that critical first 48 hours. So yes, the recommendations that do go through have been consistently demonstrated to improve ewe and lamb survival for all causes, and recognising that really supporting the ewe through that birthing process, but to try and offset those problems that we see with dystocia, will have demonstrated impacts for ewe and lamb survival. So yes, I think Mary, the project that Mary's described really complements what we have, and what it does is it allows us to put the emphasis to effectively the right sheep in different production systems.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you, Mary, for giving us the overview of the project. And thank you, Caroline, Gordon and Paul, for sitting on our expert panel tonight. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Just so you know, these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website. If you have any friends or family who would like to listen to the webinar at a later date, they will be online by Friday. When you exit this webinar, please do take the time to do the exit survey, which will pop up as you exit the webinar. Obviously, tonight was a bit of a new format, so it would be great to get your feedback on the sort of panel format to see how you liked it and if you have any further recommendations on how we might improve the way we deliver. Again, thank you so much to our expert panel tonight. It was really great to have you on and look into the big hitters for ewe and lamb survival going into lambing. So thanks again, everyone, and good night.